The Shadow's domain stretched before them in a bleak and lifeless expanse, the barren ground cracked like the dried skin beneath their feet. The air was thick. Each breath labored as if the very atmosphere rebelled against their presence. The citadel loomed ahead, an immense monolith of obsidian and iron, its spires writhing like frozen smoke. It seemed alive, pulsing faintly, with a rhythm that matched the oppressive thrum of the land itself. "It's worse than I imagined," Lyra said, her voice steady but low, as if afraid to wake the shadows that clung to every crevice. "What did you expect?" Kale muttered, his tone laced with unease. "Flowers and sunshine?" "Quiet!" Kata snapped, her shield raised as her eyes scanned the desolate horizon. "We're exposed here." Rodan stopped suddenly, his staff glowing faintly. The others turned to him, waiting for an explanation. "The Sepulcher is near," he said. His hollow voice carried a weight of sorrow. "We're about to step onto hallowed ground, or what's left of it." "The Sepulcher?" Elric asked, keeping his voice low. "What is it?" "The place where Nevermore broke the oath," Rodan replied, his skeletal hand tightening around his staff. "It's not just a tomb, it's a wound the land itself remembers." The terrain grew harsher as they pressed on. The cracked earth gave way to jagged rocks that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Shadows moved in the periphery, but they were not creatures, not entirely. Flickering figures of light and smoke seemed to reenact battles from another time, their ethereal cries echoing in the still air. "These are echoes," Rodan explained as one spectral warrior swung a blade that passed through Dane harmlessly. "Fragments of the past, trapped in the moment of Nevermore's betrayal." Ahead, the rocks opened into a wide chasm, its edges jagged and sharp. At the center of the chasm lay the Sepulcher, a massive altar of cracked stone surrounded by the remnants of ancient pillars. The area radiated a deep crimson light, pulsing faintly like a dying heartbeat. "This is where it happened," Rodan said, his voice quieter now, "where Nevermore made the pact." The group approached cautiously, the weight of the place pressing heavily on them. As they drew closer, they saw the markings carved on the altar, symbols of protection, unity, and balance, defaced with jagged lines that bled shadow. At the center of the altar lay a broken sword, its hilt blackened and its blade shattered. "That's his," Dane said grimly, nodding toward the sword. "The Oathbreaker's blade." Elric stepped closer, feeling the warmth in his chest intensify. The broken sword seemed to pull at him, as though it recognized something within him. He reached out, but Rodan's voice stopped him. "Don't touch it," the mage warned. "The blade still carries the weight of his betrayal. It would consume you in an instant." Elric withdrew his hand, though the pull of the sword still lingered. He clenched his fists, frustration and curiosity warring within him. "There has to be a way," he murmured, almost to himself. The warmth in his chest pulsed again, stronger this time, and he gasped softly. He realized then that it wasn't the sword that was calling him, but something within himself. "Elric, step back," Kata said firmly. "We don't know what that thing could do to you." But Elric couldn't move. The warmth in his chest spread, filling him with a strange mixture of fear and resolve. The shadows around the altar seemed to twist and coil toward him, and for a brief moment, he felt as though he were standing in two places at once. He saw flashes of Nevermore's life, the oath sworn in blood, the betrayal that shattered him, and the shadow that consumed him. "I can't," Leave it here, Elric said, his voice trembling but determined. He looked at Rordan. There has to be a way to take it without letting it destroy me. Rordan hesitated, his skeletal face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. The blade is broken, he said. Its power is fractured, but not gone. If you're willing to bear its burden, there's a way, but it will cost you. What cost? Lyra said sharply. The shadow doesn't take, it gives, Rordan replied cryptically. But it gives what you cannot control. Elric, if you choose this path, you must bind it to yourself. The shadow will enter you, and it will never leave. Elric nodded, his eyes fixed on the sword. If that's what it takes to stop this, I'll do it. Ignoring the protests of the others, Elric stepped forward and gripped the hilt of the broken blade. Pain shot through him like lightning, and he cried out, his knees buckling. The shadow surged from the altar, coiling around him and plunging into his chest. He gasped as the warmth in his chest became a burning fire, and the shadows settled deep within him. The sword's fragments began to glow, lifting from the altar and reassembling in his hands. The blade was whole again, and its edges gleaming with a dark, otherworldly light. Elric stood, his breathing ragged, but his stance stronger than before. Elric? Kata asked cautiously. He turned to face them, his eyes faintly glowing with a soft amber light. I'm fine, he said, his voice steadier than it had been before. He lifted the Oathbreaker's blade, feeling its weight as though it had always been his. Have I cursed myself? Elric asked Rordan. Before Rordan could answer, the air grew cold. The faint whispers that had followed them through the veil rose into a chorus of wails. The shadows around the sepulcher twisted and writhed, forming a figure cloaked in darkness. Its fiery eyes burned as it stepped toward them, and the sword began to glow faintly. The figure's voice was like a dozen voices speaking at once, deep and resonant.
You tread upon sacred ground, mortals. Why have you come?
Dane stepped forward, his sword drawn. We've come to stop you, Oathbreaker, to end this once and for all. The figure chuckled, a hollow, chilling sound.
Then prove it. You cannot end what I've become. My oath was broken not by my hand alone, but by the lives of those who swore to stand with me.
You were betrayed? Lyra asked, her eyes narrowing. By whom? Naramor's fiery gaze fixed on her.
By the very ones who bound me to this land. They cast me into the shadow, thinking they could cleanse their sins. But I endured. I became the shadow.
You've destroyed everything you were meant to protect, Kata said, her voice firm. Your betrayal doesn't justify the destruction you've unleashed.
And yet here you stand,
Namor said, his tone mocking.
Driven by the same oaths and promises that broke me. Do you truly believe that you are different?
We're not you, Elric said, stepping forward despite the weight of the Oathbreaker's gaze. And we won't make the same mistakes. Naramor's form flickered, the shadows around him swirling violently.
Then prove it!
The ground beneath them trembled, and the pillars surrounding the sepulcher came to life, their shattered fragments raising into the air. The shadows solidified into spectral guardians, each wielding weapons of pure darkness. Hold your ground, Kata shouted, raising her shield as the guardians charged. The battle was chaos. Dane met the first guardian head-on, his blade clashing against its shadowy weapon with a resounding clang. Lyra unleashed bolts of lightning from her staff, the energy searing through the spectral form, but failing to destroy them completely. Kale darted between the Guardians, his daggers finding weak points in their defenses, while Corrin worked desperately to keep the group healed. Elric found himself locked in combat with a Guardian, his sword feeling unwieldy in his hands. Each strike was met with a parry, the force of the blows reverberating through his arms. He was thrown back, landing hard on the ground, as the Guardian loomed over him. "Get up!" Kata shouted, intercepting the Guardian's strike with her shield. "You're stronger than you think, Elric!" Rordan, meanwhile, focused his magic on the pillars, chanting an incantation that caused their floating fragments to falter. "The pillars are binding him," he shouted. "Break them, and we weaken him." With a shared glance, the group shifted their focus. Dane and Kata pushed toward one pillar, their combined strength shattering it with a thunderous crack. Lyra and Kale targeted another, her magic and his precision strikes breaking it apart piece by piece. Elric found himself alongside Rordan, guarding the mage as he worked to collapse the final pillar. As the last pillar crumbled, Nairmor's form flickered violently. His fiery eyes dimmed, and the spectral guardians dissolved into mist.
"You think this will stop me?"
He roared, his voice filled with rage and pain.
"The shadow cannot be undone."
"We're not here to undo it," Rordan said, stepping forward. "We're here to finish what you started." The Oathbreaker's form began to dissipate, his voice fading into the shadows.
"You cannot escape the price. The shadow always takes its due."
As silence fell over the sepulcher, the group stood amidst the ruins, their breaths heavy. The unbroken sword no longer glowed, and the oppressive weight of the shadows had lifted slightly. "It's not over," Lyra said quietly. "This was only a piece of him." "And the necromancer?" Corrin asked. Rordan turned toward the citadel in the distance. "That's where we find the answers." With weary resolve, the group gathered their strength and set their sights on the next leg of their journey. The Shadow's heart awaited, and with it, the truth of Nairmor's fall. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded. The citadel loomed ahead, and with the Oathbreaker's blade in Elric's hands, their resolve solidified. The weak boy they had known was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who carried both the light and the shadow within him.